We're going to change and take a look at a topic that we've seen already, and that's macro programming. Let me just make sure I don't have anything like real. Oh, yeah, I've got a couple things on the slides, but we've talked about that too, so I think I can just jump into this. We'll see. Let me know if something seems really strange to you. We've taken a look at macro programming once, and then don't forget, using Microsoft Office Word, if you don't have the Developer tab here, you'd have to go to the Office button, Word Options, and then select Show Developer tab on the ribbon to get that. One way to record a macro is to use the macro recorder, and that's what you did before. Basically what it was doing was copying your steps and then remembering them. There's another way to create a macro, and that's by actual programming. And that's what we're going to investigate today. Rather than recording the commands that I'm going to do, I'm going to issue instructions. I'm going to be a programmer. There are some advantages and disadvantages to programming a macro. The disadvantage is you have to learn a programming language. The programming language is called VBA, Visual Basic for Applications. Unfortunately, the coding text doesn't talk about VBA. It talks about VB script, which is similar, but certainly not exactly the same thing. But there may be some areas in VB script that will help you with VBA, Visual Basic for Applications. And online you'll find some other resources that I pointed you to. And I really think with the introduction that I give you here, you'll be able to do anything within reason that you need to. And specifically a homework assignment this time dealing with creating a macro by programming it. The other advantage to programming your macro rather than just using the macro recorder is there's some things that we can't record easily. There are some ideas and concepts, for example, repetition. Or another example is varying, using a variable or a field. Those ideas really don't translate well with the macro recorder, but are kinds of things that can be done easily with programming. Now, I know I said the second one. I never told you the first one. But sometimes programming is just, well, it's fun, it's interesting, and it's exciting. But sometimes it's more efficient, too, to give it the instructions rather than trying to figure out where all the commands and poking through and doing that. All right. Let me get some text on there. And you saw this little trick before. The rand command, equal rand, and I tell it the number of paragraphs and the number of sentences in that paragraphs. And you're saying, where's this text? It's either from the help or it's just some randomly generated text. Okay? What I'm going to do, I'm going to first of all do something with the macro recorder, and then I'm going to show you the code that was generated. When you did that macro assignment in Unit 1, hopefully I gave you, I made some comment. Why don't you take a look at the code, see if you can figure out what's happening there. And I wasn't expecting you to be able to do that. But let's go ahead and do some things now. Okay? I'm going to go to the Developer tab. And again, just as we did before, I'm going to go to the macro, the code area. And I'm going to issue record macro. Now, we'll remind you of two things here. Number one, give your macro a meaningful name. I'm going to call mine demo, which is not a meaningful name, but give it a meaningful name. And then remember, if you want to be able to distribute this macro, if you want it to go to somebody else, save it in that document. You save it in the normal template, I'm not going to be able to see it. So save it in that document and give it a description. Oops. Now, my name and my description are not very interesting. The other thing I told some of you, and I want you to remember this time, is in the comment area, in the description area of the macro, be sure to put your name and date. Those kinds of things are important. Yeah. Now, I'm going to issue OK, so I've got a name, storing it in that document. I got a description or comment. And you remember what happens. Here's my little cassette icon indicating that it's going to record things. All right? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm first of all going to home the cursor. I'm going to control home the cursor. That, no matter where I am, that will get me to the very top. Now, I'm going to select, I'm going to highlight this entire line. I'm going to do that with Shift-End. And then, I'm going to apply some type of highlighting to it, a color. I'll find that under the Home tab, and in the font area of the ribbon, you can see there's a font color, and then there is a text highlight color. Let's highlight in yellow. I'll select that. I don't know how well you can tell, but it's actually been done. Okay? Then, I'm going to move the cursor down. I'm just going to move it down 2. And now I'm done. So back to the Developer tab, stop recording, and we're set. What we're going to do now is we're going to go to the macro area here, and this is how we ran our macros before. But rather than running it, I'm going to select the Edit button. Edit will do 2 things. It will show me the code, and then it will allow me to make changes to that code. So I'm going to macros in the code section of the developer code area of developer. I'm going to select Edit. Now I get a brand new window and a brand new user interface here. This is popped over Microsoft's Word standard ribbon and user interface. This is the Visual Basic Development Environment. I don't know if you could see it in the title bar here. It says Microsoft Visual Basic. This is VBA, Visual Basic for Applications. Now, a couple things here. When I forget to demagnify that, tell me so you can see what else is happening. You see the comments there, Demo Macro and Test a Macro Recorder. This is a programming language. In VB, in Visual Basic, any line that begins with a single quote mark is a comment. Comments are ignored by the computer, but they're important for us because they are an English reminder of what's happening. Okay. Now, this first line, it looks weird, and actually this is object-oriented programming, so I have methods and method calls here, things like that. But in this first line, you see selection.homekey unit : WD story. What that's saying is home the cursor, and the unit is the quote story. That's the entire document. So when I pressed Control Home, that's the actual code for Control Home. If you were a programmer and you wanted to get the cursor to the very top of the document, that's the instruction you would enter. To remember that, I'm going to add a comment here. Oops. Control Home. Okay, this next line. Selection.endKey unit : WD line, extend, WD extend. Again, you're saying, whoa, what is that all about? Well, I highlighted this first line. I told you I held down the Shift key and I pressed End. So you can see here that it's talking about the End key, but now what's the unit? The unit is the entire line, WD line, and I'm going to extend the selection. I want to highlight that first line. So what a user would do at the keyboard, hold down the Shift key, press End if the cursor was at the beginning of that line. This is how you tell it programmatically with code. So I'm just going to add a comment here that says what I did, and that was hold down the Shift key, press the End key.
What does WD stand
Good question. All of these things, the WD is just the Visual Basic for application. Boy, it's just the way that Visual Basic is going to understand this particular object, this particular idea. It's part of what they call a naming convention. None of this is going to help, so I'm just going to say that's just the way it is. Okay? Don't worry what it stands for. It's just the way Microsoft decided to identify their features and functions. Okay? Yeah, sorry. I mean, I'd like to tell you it says stands for Word, but it's not quite that easy. Okay? Yeah. These next two lines sort of work together. And again, I'm not expecting you to understand these, but in just a second, I'm going to have you change this code, even with the little bit that you know. Okay? So this next line, options.default highlight color index equal WD yellow. If you remember, I asked for yellow highlighting. This next line actually applies the yellow highlighting. So the first one, I'm asking for yellow, and this one actually applies it to the document. And this last line here, selection.moveDown unicorn equal WD line, comma count equal 2. Remember, when I was all done, I moved the cursor down 2 lines. So move cursor down 2 lines. Sub, demo, and end sub. Sub is this subroutine. It's a function, if you will, here in Visual Basic. And demo is just the name that I gave it. All right. Now, what if when I was done with this, I wanted to move down 3 lines and not 2 lines?
Just change the switches.
Exactly. Tell me exactly what to change.
Count.
Count? Yep. 3, right? Absolutely. If I change from 2 to 3 here, I'm going to tell the cursor move down 3 rather than moving down 2. What if I wanted to highlight in green? What would I change to highlight in green there? Yeah. Now, sometimes guessing doesn't work really well. And it may be that green is, maybe called gray green or something, who knows. And not every color you can dream of is there, don't try fuchsia. But there is a green. All right? Now, when I'm done, I don't know anything about programming VBA, but once I see what each of these instructions do, I can actually change them. And let's see if it works. Now, you're saying, how do I get back? This thing popped completely over Office Word. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close down this whole thing. Now, that's not going to close Word. It's going to close down Visual Basic. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. It's going to loot. No. As soon as I enter each of these statements and move the cursor, it's being remembered. It's being saved automatically. Okay. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to get rid of that just so I can have a clean slate. And I'm going to just move the cursor here somewhere. Let's run our macro. What we said is it ought to highlight the first line in green and then move down 3. So let's run the macro. Macro, call demo, run. There it is. So my first line is green. And notice my cursor, rather than being on line 3, is on line 4. It moved down 3 rather than 2. Cool. By the way, in the bad old days of information technology, output used to be on something called green bar. Green bar, I used to have some. Oh, here it is. Green bar was this paper looked like this, and you notice that there are green and white bars on it. That was to make it easier to find things when you had gigantic outputs just like this. Sometimes people do this today. If you're looking at a legal brief for a law, there are lines numbered on there, and sometimes they'll even highlight lines. A very useful technique is to highlight every third line of a document. Our eye can follow the highlighted line or the one right after it or the one before the other highlight very easily. So highlighting every third line is just a very common technique to allow you to read across columns. Let's just say, you know, reading across words isn't hard, but what if these are a bunch of numbers and I want to keep my place? Then that would be very helpful. What if we wanted to make a macro that would do that? Now, of course, I could do that manually, right? I could home the cursor, highlight that line in green, which I did, move down, highlight this line in green, and then highlight this line in green. Okay. If I had lots and lots of lines, that'd be time-consuming. And the other thing, I might not even know how many lines are in the document. So let's get a macro to highlight every third line for me. Let's go back into the code. So again, oh shoot. Could you see what happened? I forgot I had that. Could you see what was going on there? Okay, even though it was zoomed in. Okay, if you can't tell me so I can zoom out the display here for on-campus folks. Let's go back into the macro area, select my macro demo, and edit again so I could see the code. Here's all the code that I had. And the next thing I might like to do is to repeat this, right? Well, one way to repeat it would be just to copy most of this code. Now, I don't want to copy the first line because that would then home the cursor and I'd get nowhere. But you know, if I copied these lines here, then after moving down 2 or 3 or whatever it is, it would highlight in green and move down again. But how many times? The answer is I don't really know. So I want to introduce, last time we talked about that repetition control structure, looping. I want to introduce that to you. Now this would have to be, I mean, somebody's just going to have to tell you how to do that. That's why I'm going to do that right now. There's a statement in Visual Basic called dim. It stands for dimension. It doesn't mean anything to us, but it's a way to declare a variable. I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it count. In Visual Basic, when I create a variable, I have to type it. I have to tell Visual Basic what type it is. Notice sometimes that this autocomplete comes up. It's actually a very useful thing, but we're going to ignore it right now. I'm going to dim a variable called count as an integer. What that means is I now have available to me a field, a variable called count, and I'm going to use that to keep track of things. What I'm going to do is I'm first of all going to set it to 0. This first instruction here is used to create a variable. It's called count. This next instruction, I'm going to, quote, initialize the value to 0. I'm going to start somewhere. I could start anywhere I want to. I have a variable called count. I'm going to initially set it to 0. Now, what I'm going to do based upon, I'm going to add this idea of this variable that will count to another concept known as repetition. I'm going to give an instruction here where I'm going to tell the system, I want you to repeat this so many times. There are several ways to do repetition in Visual Basic, and I've got some references online. You'll learn about it, or very similar to what you see in your text, the coding text for Visual Basic script. The statement I'm going to use is a do. It's called do until. And I'm going to phrase it like this. I'm just going to indent here. It's not required, but it'll just make it easier to see the structure. Do until. Did you notice, by the way, that when I moved off that line that it not only capitalized some things, but it changed colors of things? Visual Basic is checking my syntax to make sure that my statements are accurate. If I type something incorrectly, if I did something like instead of do, I said dope until, as soon as I move the cursor, you'll say, whoa, hey, what's that? What's a dope until? I don't know. Okay? Oh, I just made a mistake. So if you're entering things and a window pops up saying, I don't know what you're talking about, then just double check. You likely just either mistyped the name of something or a similar syntax problem. Do until begins what we call a do block. All the statements after do until another keyword, and that other keyword is loop. Everything between here is part of this so-called do block. And what's going to happen, maybe it makes sense, I'm going to do the statements in this block until something happens, until the variable count is greater than 2. Now, I'm in essence setting up count as a counter. What I'm going to do then, each time through the loop, I'm going to increment count. I'm going to take its current value, add 1 to it, and then resave it, restore it into the same variable count such that I'm incrementing or updating. Count starts at 0. I'm going to continually do this until count is greater than 2. I want you to think about, can you figure out how many times count will be executed? Just think in your own mind, because we'll just do it right now and find out. Okay? Let's see. Now, I could save things as I want to. There's a little save icon here, but every time you move the cursor, every time you enter something, it's automatically saved. So I'm just going to exit out of the popover VB window, get back to Word here. I'm going to put my cursor down here. Something funny is going to happen. See if you could tell why it's going to do this funny thing. You might think, and this is what we wanted it to do, right? It's highlight the first line, then move down a couple, highlight the next line. Darn, it's not going to do that. Are you ready? I thought it should do it maybe 2 or 3 or some number like, why did it only do it 1 time? You know what? It did do it, well, I won't tell you how many times yet. It did do it more than once, but here's the problem. You see what it did? Anybody want to guess what the problem is, looking at the code here? And again, even, oops, I forgot to comment my do loop and the counter thing, but oh well. Look at the body of the loop. Can you tell what it was doing? It was looping. It did execute this body more than once. Why didn't it look like it? That first instruction there says, home the cursor. You know what's going to happen? Every time we repeat this, it's going to home the cursor. So it homed the cursor, then it moved down, but rather than highlighting the line it was on, it homed the cursor. Darn. This is what we call a semantic error, an error in meaning. That's not what I wanted to have happen. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move that statement outside of the loop because I don't want it done multiple times. I only want that done once. Sorry. Now let's try it. Are you ready? Do, macros, run. What's it doing? Look, the cursor is down here. Why isn't it highlighting those other things? Macro. Oh, but it's not because of this. It's not. You're thinking, well, the comment says yellow. I know we changed that to green, etc. Okay. I want you to. I don't know. Maybe that's too deep. Macro run. Think about it for a little bit. Okay. I want to introduce one other, as you're thinking about that, I want to introduce one other statement that you'll find important and interesting. And by the way, yeah, I was going to tell you something. Yeah. I don't want to forget. Don't let me just leave this without showing you what went wrong there, okay? That's important. You need to know what happened there. Okay. I won't integrate this next thing into the code, but there's another command that I want you to be familiar with, and that's the command called input box. I'm going to type some. It's not going to like this, but I'll explain why it doesn't like it in just a second. I'm going to type another statement here. I'm going to say number equal input box, and then I'm going to give it a parameter. You notice there's some things popping up here, okay, etc. When I run this, it's actually going to yell at me about this, but I want you to see what happens. Okay. Let me fix that. It's going to yell. It's already yelling about something else. Dim number as integer. Okay. All right. Now, anybody know why isn't it highlighting those lines? It's moving down. Well, here's the reason why. When I did shift end here, that highlighted the entire line, but you know what? It leaves the cursor at the end of the line. So then it is actually, the next time it is extending the selection, but it's extending it from the end of the line to the end of the line. So it's basically highlighting nothing at the very end of the line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another thing here. What I want to do is I don't want to home the cursor, but I just want to bring the cursor to the beginning of that line. Okay? Oh, well, there's no way for you to guess this. It is a selection.home key, but it's a different unit. It's not WD story. Since I may not know what it is, what I could do here is I could either just start guessing and try some things, or I can actually record a macro and then see what it says. Okay. I want to see if it's going to give me any help here. It's not. And you know, folks, I can't remember because I'm not a Visual Basic expert. But let's just pretend that this is going to do what we want here. Selection.HomeKey unit equal WD line. So notice here selection.HomeKey for the whole story, that is the whole document. But here, I want it to go to the beginning of the line. That will get me set up to highlight the entire line rather than just the end of the line. I don't know what's going to happen. Let's try it. Let's get rid of the current highlight. Let's move our cursor someplace else. Unfortunately, now a couple things should happen when I run it. First of all, we get this message. How many? Doesn't matter what I type in because I don't have that connected semantically to the program, but I could type in something and move on. Ah, that's better. Okay. Now here it went to the top, extend selection, moved down to, and then went to the beginning of the line, extend selection, highlight, move down to beginning of the line, da-da-da, and then here it is ending there. So it actually did it 3 times. Very good. You're wondering, why is it 3 when this says 2? Well, it's a combination of the fact that it starts at 0, and then we're asking strictly greater than 2, right? Okay. If you're wondering why we did this, it's because one of the assignments that you'll see for today is going to ask you to create a macro very similar to what I've begun here for you. Your macro is also going to highlight lines every third line in a document. But unlike my macro, your macro is going to ask the user, how many lines do you want me to highlight? And then it's going to do that many. So you need to think, how can I do that? Here's a big hint. Use this input box, use another variable, and somehow connect the two together. You know, here I said 2. Well, maybe the answer isn't 2. Maybe it's something else. Investigate logical operations. Here I just have a greater than. Maybe you could have an equal to or a greater than and equal to and make it do something different. I don't want you to get frustrated. It's easy to get frustrated with I was trying to illustrate many things that can go wrong here, right? It seems like things can work. Why isn't it? Because of this semantic error and error in meaning. Tracking those things down is hard. Think logically. Think like a computer. Just follow the algorithm and don't assume anything. Just do it. Online at Angel, by the assignment itself, there'll be a little bit of instructions, not only what to do, but also some other resources. And perhaps the section on VB script in your coding text will help with that also. When you're all done then, just like you did before, you'll save this, but remember, save as and choose a format that supports a macro. For example, docx doesn't do it. Right? Docm, a Word macro-enabled document, will do it. Save it like that, upload it, and you're all set. Do you have any questions right now about macro programming with Visual Basic for applications?
Am I able to do this by the first assignment when you do it without edits?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you do this without programming? The answer is no. And here's why. There is no way to do, there's a couple things here that you can't do just by doing the macro recorder. The input box you can't do. There is no way to give a command that says put up an input box because we're always doing that. And the other thing that you can't do is this loop. There is no way using the macro recorder to say loop X times, right? That's a great question. So here's an example where, nope, the macro recorder won't help you. The macro recorder is a powerful tool, but the Visual Basic editor is an even more powerful tool. We're actually using this programming language. So sorry, you can't just use the recorder. You're going to have to investigate. Now, you can use the recorder in this way. You can do certain things and then look at the code and see what it does. Okay? Like if you had no idea, you know, how do I home the cursor? Well, guess what? Go to the recorder, home the cursor, and then save that and look and see what the code was. And then you could copy that. Okay? So other than the input box and other than the do, and there are other kinds of loops besides just do, you could, but no, you got to use VB for that. Good question. Any other questions right now about macros, Visual Basic programming? Now, will you remember what I just did here? No. But for those of you on campus, don't forget the course cast is for you. So this is all recorded. You can hear me talking about it. You'll see it happening here, et cetera, et cetera. So no, I'm not expecting you to remember that at all. And that's why I'm recording this. Folks at a distance, obviously, this is going to help. This is my primary communication tool to you. All right. Distance folks, you have some things to do, and our on-campus folks are going to do something different after our break. So this is the last you'll hear from me on the course cast. Distance, folks, be sure to take a look. You're in Unit 3 now. You already know that. Take a look at the assignments. You got questions, contact me. Same for you on campus.